More now on our top story this morning, those rules that will force banks to hold more capital. Regulators meeting in Basel, Switzerland agreed on the requirements over the weekend. Joining us by phone from Basel is Dr. William White. Bill has been called the man nobody wanted to hear. He's a former chief economist for the BIS, the central bank for central banks, and he's currently chairman of the Economic Development and Review Committee at the OECD. Bill, welcome to InsideTrack. Let's start with this. These talks in Basel over the weekend ended in a compromise, and you know what everybody says about compromises, they are the enemy of good policy. Is that the case here?
Well, you know the expression, the best is often the enemy of the good. I think, in fact, what came out here on the weekend is not very much different from what was proposed in the middle of July, and that, in turn, was not a million miles different from what they originally proposed in December. So there's been some element of backing off here. I think it's perfectly reasonable for the regulators to listen with open ears to what it is that the bankers have to say and to try to make some compromises. But this thing is not sort of very much different from what was originally anticipated.
Bill, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being the status quo, the way things are now, and 10 being the perfect set, let's call it, of capital and liquidity requirements, where would you put this package?
Well, I guess the central point to keep in mind here is that this is only one element amongst a whole variety of things that needs to be done in order to ensure that we don't have the kind of meltdown in the future that we've had in the past. So I think it is very important that we have more capital, that we have higher quality capital, that we have more liquidity. All of these things are important, but they've also got to be blended in with better resolution regimes so that big firms can be wound down in an orderly way. We need to have closer attention paid to trading books and information about what it is that people are actually up to, the degree to which one firm is taking positions that may in fact affect other firms. So this is a really important step forward, but I think everybody would say that it's one thing out of a number of things that needs to be done.
I'm going to key in on a couple of points you just made there. The first being the meltdown. Bill, in your opinion, had these requirements been in place before 2007, would we have experienced the financial crisis we just went through?
Well, I think clearly it wouldn't have been as severe as the one that we have just gone through. But I do remind you that some of those firms, I think Lehman, if I'm not mistaken, they had a double-digit capital ratio the day before they went under because they ran into a really serious problem of uncertainty about the kinds of assets that they were holding and how much those assets were worth. Then there was a kind of liquidity run. So capital is very important. There's no question about that. But it's not the magic bullet, as it were. It's going to be helpful to reduce the probability of default, and therefore it's going to be helpful in terms of reducing the probability of systemic crises. But it's not a magic bullet. There's a lot of other things that have to be looked at as well.
How about the question of assets, though, because it just came up in the context of Lehman. Is it right to allow the banks themselves to determine the riskiness of their own assets? Some people would say that was one of the pitfalls of Basel II. Much of it appears to be intact in Basel III.
Well, there is no question that if you allow the banks to do their own independent assessment of the quality of those assets and the riskiness associated with it, that there will be on occasion times when the banks are going to become perhaps less concerned about the riskiness of those assets than they should be. This is what the BIS used to refer to as an element of pro-cyclicality in the financial system. But then, of course, the question becomes, if the banks themselves, having all of the knowledge that they've got, can't do the job of properly evaluating the riskiness of all those individual assets, who's going to do it for them?
Well, that's a good question, Bill, but before we go, I have to ask you, do you trust the banks to evaluate the riskiness of their own assets? Maybe they're inclined to do so today, but 5 years from now?
Well, I think we're going to have to be clearly careful as time wears on, as the memory of all this starts to fade, that the risk management procedures, okay, now let's not talk about individual decisions with respect to individual assets, but whether the banks have got in place risk management procedures that seem robust enough to fend off this kind of a problem. And
Bill,
that's something the supervisors are going to have to work real hard at.